Well, welcome to Dairy Livestream. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, managing editor of Horde's Dairyman. We are broadcasting live here from our Cheese Cave, our studio in downtown Fort Atkinson at the historic W.D. Horde and Sons Company building commissioned by Wisconsin Governor W.D. Horde. What we might want and what we might get from Washington, that's the question on the minds as many as we prepare for a change in the executive branch and transition to a new president in January. As you hear from our panelists today, please submit your questions. I remind our audience to ask questions early as we received a number of pre-broadcasts, and you can do that in your go-to webinar control panel. As our prelude to our first guest, let's go to a poll question. If our producer Jim can put that on screen. What's the most important big picture topic in regards to dairy? A, environment, B, labor, C, nutrition, and nutrition would be as it relates to food and nutrition programs administered by USDA, or D, trade. So go ahead and answer that. Obviously, we could have put a number of other topics on there, but those are the ones we chose here today. And we wanted to hear what you were thinking. We got 43% voted here. We'll wait till we get over the 50% mark. And there's a big time leader here, Dave. It'll be interesting when we see those final results. Let's go ahead and close the polls here. We're over 60%. And the big leader there was trade, with labor and environment really neck and neck there in the nutrition part of it, distant fourth. So our first dairy live stream panelists will shed some light as to the future of those topics. David Carlin has been examining and providing strategic perspective on dairy markets for nearly 4 decades. This Kansas dairy farm boy eventually earned his law degree from Harvard University. Later, he served as Assistant Secretary for Congressional Relations under President Bill Clinton. After working nearly 26 years in the private sector as a lawyer for a public law and policy firm, Carlin returned to his dairy roots by joining the International Dairy Foods Association as Senior Vice President of Legislative Affairs and Economic Policy. For those Holstein aficionados out there, you may also be interested in knowing that the famed Carlin M. Ivanhoe Bell Bull was born on the Carlin farm a number of years ago in Kansas. David, welcome to the program. What might the political winds of Washington, D.C. have in store for the coming year?
Well, thank you, Corey, and it's a great pleasure to be with all of you today. And thank you for mentioning Carlin M. Ivanhoe Bell. That was probably my father's proudest achievement in life. I think I come in close second or third or fourth there, but anyway, I'm always glad to be reminded of that legacy. And I'm also glad to be on a panel today with Paul Bleiberg, my colleague at National Milk, and Paul and I work together on so many issues affecting our industry on Capitol Hill and the administration. So it's always good to be with Paul. But let me kick us off this morning by just reminding us kind of a few of the upcoming key dates as we get ready for the start of the 117th Congress and the start of a new administration. We've all been focused for what seems like years on the November elections, and I think I can speak for everybody on the call today that we're pretty happy to have that election behind us, and are looking forward to moving forward. But there are still a few things that have to take place before the new administration can take over at USDA and across the executive branch. And the first key date is December 14th. And that's when each of the electors in the states will formally vote to put forward their state's choice for president and vice president. And so that's a little more or a little less than 2 weeks away. And then the second part of that equation will be in January 6th, when the Congress will be in session to formally receive those electoral votes. And that will really certify the results of the November 3rd election. Now, I think we're all pretty aware of where things are headed. I think even the White House is now aware of where things are headed. So Paul and I are already gearing up for a new administration and a new Congress, and we'll talk more about that with you today. But those are two of the key dates that we're paying attention to. And on the congressional front, the new Congress will actually convene in early January. They're supposed to start on January 3rd, but that's a Sunday this year, so more likely at the 4th or 5th. And then, as I said, they'll go into a joint session on the 6th to receive those electoral votes and to formally certify the election results from the presidential election. Now, that means that we're all, looking forward to January 20th, which is the constitutional date for the president to be inaugurated at noon that day, and that will take place on January 20th as needed. And that's the day that Joe Biden will have his first opportunity to affect his policies, beginning with executive orders that he plans to sign that very afternoon. So when some of you may be curious as to how soon we'll start to see the imprint of the new administration, and I think I can predict with some certainty that there will be executive orders signed on January 20th that could have impacts on agriculture and the dairy industry. Some of those will be more of the big picture items like the Muslim travel ban and addressing the DACA dreamer population here and how they're treated under immigration laws, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, so on and so forth. So those are sort of bigger things that the president will do on his first day. But there will be a number of other executive actions that he'll be preparing to take along those lines as well. And the transition teams that are now in place at USDA, FDA, USTR, and across the federal government are organizing to make those decisions possible as early as they can in the new administration. So we anticipate them hitting the ground running. It doesn't hurt that Joe Biden's been here before. Joe Biden, as you know, was vice president for 8 years. He knows how the administration functions. He's not new to this role. So even though the transition has taken a little longer to start this time, I don't think there's going to be much lag time in terms of getting people on the ground and decision makers in place. Now, one of the other things I'll address quickly before I turn it over to Paul to talk about Congress is the Ag Secretary position. And as a former Ag Secretary official during the Clinton years, as Corey mentioned, we're keenly paying attention to who the new president designates to serve in that important role. There are a couple of names that have been put forward and are at top of mind at this point. Marcia Fudge, a congresswoman, 7-term congresswoman from the Cleveland, Ohio area, who is a senior member of the House Agriculture Committee, is one name that is being considered. And then also Heidi Heitkamp, a former senator from North Dakota, who served as Attorney General before she was a 1-term senator from North Dakota, is also being considered. So if we have a Marcia Fudge as Ag Secretary, I think based on her record, there will be she will spend a lot of time focusing on nutrition issues. And I know from the poll earlier that was not something that was catching our attention, but I would put to you that we should be paying very close attention to nutrition issues at the department, particularly if Marcia Fudge is the new secretary, because one of the things that we have been able to achieve during the last administration was a return to having 1% flavored milk served in schools. And that was not the case during the Obama-Biden years. That was skim flavored milk, and kids didn't like the taste of that. So milk consumption declined in schools. Trump administration reversed that. We're hopeful that the new administration will not go backwards on that issue, but Paul and I are going to have to work hard to make sure that doesn't happen. And if Marcia Fudge is the secretary, that's something we're going to have to pay closer attention to, perhaps, than if Heidi Heitkamp is in that chair. So I think the new team will start very soon. We've had Ag secretaries confirmed as early as January 20th, Inauguration Day. Both Ann Veneman during the George W. Bush years was sworn in on January 20th, as was Tom Vilsack during the Obama years. But I would say that with the Trump administration, Sonny Perdue was not sworn in until late April. So my projection is that we're looking more maybe in between those two time periods for our new secretary, but we'll see. Things are developing every day here, and we're all trying to keep a very close eye on things. So with that, let me pause and let Corey introduce Paul.
Well, thank you, Dave. I hope our audience really appreciates the insight we have gathered here. And you said a lot in 8 minutes, Dave. Wow. I really appreciate it. Our next Dairy Livestream guest came up with the poll, excuse me, I'm jumping ahead here, getting excited. We got a poll question here. Before we invite our next guest to Dairy Livestream, let's go to that question. Name the year the U.S. last had a president who was a Democrat, a Republican Senate, and a House that was controlled by the Democrats. That's what the D's and R's are there. So your options are President Jimmy Carter, 1977, President Harry Truman, 1945, President Woodrow Wilson, 1913, President Grover Cleveland, 1887. Yes, those are all Democratic presidents if you're going to start looking around. So go ahead and answer that poll question. And the top answer is not, the correct answer is in last place right now. So this is going to be rather historical here. Let's go ahead and cut that one off. And the right answer is this gentleman named Grover Cleveland, who was the only president in American history to be elected to a 4-year term. Then President Harrison served in between them, and then Grover Cleveland came back to the White House. So what we're really saying here, this is pretty darn unique. I'm going to ask that Caitlin put up this little slide here for a brief second before we go to Paul here. This is a slide that really describes that. And the top of it's the Senate seats, the bottom of it's the House seats, and right in the middle is that little bar. And we got to go all the way to the left to go back to 1887. You'll see there's many times in American history where the executive branch and both houses of Congress are in the same control, but that's really changed a lot in the modern era here. When the president traditionally gets elected, you sweep in probably the same party on both ends. So Paul's going to expand on that. And Paul came up with that poll question, so I really need to give him credit on that. Paul Bleiberg started his Washington career as a legislative correspondent for House Representative Sherman Bullard, and was a legislative assistant to House Representative John Kuhl, a pair of New York State Republicans. Bleiberg then became chief of staff and legislative director for House Representative Reed Ribble from Wisconsin. Bleiberg joined the National Milk Producers Federation staff in 2016 and now serves as Senior Vice President of Government Relations. Paul, we're about to see the most unique congressional and executive branch interaction since the late 1880s. How might the next few years play out?
Well, thanks, Corey, for that introduction and for the chance to be on here and to be on here with Dave. As Dave noted, we do a lot of work together between our organizations on a whole range of dairy issues, and it's nice to see Andy on here too. I was excited when I found out the answer to that question myself a few weeks ago, because I was trying to figure it out, and I started to think it was sometime in the early part of the 20th century, and I realized I had to go back a little bit further, and I finally got to the Grover Cleveland first term and started quizzing people on that, and most people had no idea. They thought it was Obama, they thought it was Carter. Half the time people didn't know who controlled Congress, and most people don't pay too close attention to that sort of thing. So it was mostly a fun brain teaser for people, but it is interesting, and it does get to the point you made that oftentimes when somebody gets elected president, the Congress is already, sometimes in the hands of that party. Usually the chambers don't flip in a presidential election. They tend to flip in midterms, and that leads me into my starting point, which is barring a surprising outcome on January 6th, in which 2 Georgia Senate seats will be up for runoff elections. That's probably once again the case here. We are likely to have a Republican Senate and a Democratic House, both of which will be somewhat more closely divided than they were this current Congress, and in the case of the House, will be significantly more closely divided. Depending on the outcome of one remaining race, we are looking at either a House where you have a 222-seat Democratic majority or a 223-seat, and then an either 213 or 212-seat Republican minority. And it just so happens that the one district that is not decided is my own district. In central New York is New York's 22nd congressional district. It is not going to be decided this week. There are a couple of thousand ballots in dispute one way or another that a state Supreme Court judge in New York is looking over. And for those who are familiar, that's the race between current Congressman Anthony Brindisi, who's a freshman Democratic member of the House, and Republican challenger Claudia Tenney. She served previously, and Brindisi ousted her in 2018. She was running to try to win again this go around. And the lead has gone back and forth now a little bit. It's very, very close, but that just goes to show the nature of some of these close elections we have. We worked a lot with Mr. Brindisi in his term. He was the first member in my lifetime in our district to be on the House Ag Committee. So was very excited, and he really did a great job. So we'll see how that plays out. But looking at the congressional landscape here, I think as much as things may be staying the same as far as the control of the two chambers, in all likelihood, what's going to change quite a bit is the House and Senate Agriculture Committees. We're going to have 3 of the 4 committee leaders being new to their positions. And I'll talk a little bit about each of those, in turn here. In the House, we knew for a long time that there was going to be a new Republican leader because Mike Conaway from Texas, who's currently the ranking member and was previously the chairman, was term limited out of his post, and he announced fairly early last year that he was going to be retiring. So we always knew that there was going to be a race to replace him on the Republican side. That race is between 3 people. G.T. Thompson from Pennsylvania, who I'm sure has been featured in this publication in some form. He's taken a lot of interest over the years in the dairy industry, and I know we've worked closely with him as his IDFA. Congressman Rick Crawford from Arkansas, the Delta region there, and Congressman Austin Scott from Georgia. Those 3 members have all served on the Ag Committee for quite a while. They've chaired different subcommittees, and from the dairy perspective, we've worked very closely with GT, and him ascending to that role would be quite beneficial for the dairy industry, given the long-term interest he's taken there. But that race ends in about 4.5 hours. The way these are decided is the Republican Steering Committee, which is a committee made up of a bunch of House Republicans, kind of at the behest of the leadership, votes on these vacancies to run the committees, and then those go before the full conference, largely to be ratified in a kind of a pro forma way. So later this evening, we will know who's going to be the top Republican on the Agriculture Committee. The Democratic side has had a race that's really just played out in earnest over the last month. Congressman Colin Peterson from Minnesota has chaired the committee and been the ranking member of the committee for a long time. He's somebody we've worked very, very closely with on dairy. He's really long been a leader in that space, and we were very, very sad to see him lose his reelection a month ago. But him losing that spot has caused there to be a competition for the new chairman. So the 2 people in contention are Congressman David Scott from Georgia and Congressman Jim Costa from California. And both of them have served on the committee for 15, 16 years. Mr. Scott is slightly more senior. Mr. Costa is next in line. From a geographic perspective, Mr. Scott represents the Atlanta suburbs. I know we have 2 Scotts from Georgia that are vying for these roles. And Mr. Costa represents the Fresno area of the Central Valley in California. We've worked with Mr. Costa for a very long time on dairy issues as well. He grew up in the industry and has taken a lot of interest there. So the Democratic Steering and Policy Committee, which is their version of the steering arm that kind of recommends candidates, voted yesterday, and they voted in favor of Mr. Scott by a vote of 32-19. Now, on the Democratic side, it's a little different. Rather than just a sort of pro forma ratification of these votes, the individual contestants have the ability to have a vote of the full Democratic caucus if they reach a certain threshold, and Mr. Costa did that. So in all likelihood, tomorrow afternoon, the full House Democratic caucus will have a vote between Mr. Scott and Mr. Costa, and so we'll know then who's going to be the chairman. Now, Mr. Scott is probably favored, having won the vote yesterday, but those votes are not always carried through the full caucus, so we will find out. We'll find that out tomorrow. So by the end of the week, we will know who the new chairman and the new ranking member of the House Agriculture Committee are going to be. Now, obviously, Mr. Thompson and Mr. Costa are 2 people that we've worked with quite a lot. The other names I mentioned are people that don't come from as heavy regions in the dairy industry, but as we've done with folks before, we'll certainly work with whoever's in that role and the other members of the committee as well. Where there's a little bit less change, but still some, is the Senate Agriculture Committee. The Senate tends to mostly go on a seniority basis when they're changing these leadership roles. The person who's next in line tends to kind of have the first right of refusal. So with Senator Pat Roberts retiring as the chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee, he will in all likelihood be replaced by Senator John Bozeman from Arkansas, who's third in line. Next after Roberts is Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who's not going to give up being Majority Leader, understandably. So the next would go to John Bozeman from Arkansas. So Senator Bozeman will take over as the top Republican on the committee. Senator Debbie Stabenow from Michigan has been the top Democrat on the committee for the last decade, both chairman and ranking member, so she will likely continue in that role as of now. So that means we're going to have 3 of the 4 principals of the Ag committees being new to their roles. And what does that mean from a policy standpoint? It means that as we go into a new farm bill, we're going to have new priorities in play, and we're going to have a bit of a shuffling of priorities. The farm bill doesn't come due until 2023, which is the first year of the Congress after this next Congress. But from a farm bill experience, I would say that when a farm bill is due in the first year of a new Congress, right after an election, it often gets extended into the next year. So I would wager that it's very possible we'll be talking about a 2024 farm bill when all is said and done, just given the way these things work. I would expect that in this Congress, we're going to see a lot of prep work in the form of hearings and field hearings and stakeholder discussions and examining which policies from the 2018 Farm Bill are working well and which are not, to sort of create a glide path for working on this in 2023. But when you factor in that you have 3 new players and a lot of new staff in these roles, because in addition to the new principals, they're all going to, there'll be some former staff that come in, but there are going to be a lot of new staff that come in too and have to get their sea legs under them, number one. And number two, the COVID-19 pandemic is still top of mind for everybody. And so really for the first part of this next year, COVID is going to be the top priority for every committee that's being constituted right now. So it's going to be a while before they can really get around to talking about the Farm Bill in earnest, but you're going to have a new set of players. Now, what does that mean for dairy? Obviously, if we look at the 4 principles that we've had up to this point, Colin Peterson has long been a dairy champion. Senator Stabenow has been somebody we've worked with very actively in the dairy space. Mr. Conaway and Mr. Roberts, I'd say dairy hasn't really been their top issue, but we've been able to work with them. You're going to see some changes here now. On the Republican side of the House, we'll start there. If G.T. Thompson takes that spot from Mike Conaway from Pennsylvania, he's really a dairy champion. That's going to be somebody in that role who's going to make dairy his top issue or one of his top issues. On the Democratic side, if it's Jim Costa, certainly it would be a major priority for him. If it's David Scott from Georgia, not as much an issue in Georgia. So maybe lower priority for Mr. Scott, but I'd note that Mr. Scott does have a lot of Democratic members on the House Ag Committee who do have a priority on dairy, and those folks I'm sure would be in his ear, and that would impact the dynamic. On the Senate side, I'm not sure that much is going to change here. Senator Stabenow and her role, and certainly Senator Leahy and his longstanding role of kind of being active on aspects of dairy policy will continue to dominate that work in the Senate Ag Committee. Senator Bozeman from Arkansas, not much of a dairy state, so I'm not sure that you see a huge change there in the orientation of how the Senate Ag Committee will work on dairy issues, I should say. So that's a little bit of a snapshot on key congressional players, but I do want to mention one other one, especially because the poll question, Corey, said trade is the top issue for folks. The Senate Finance Committee is the committee that covers trade policy for the most part in the Senate. The Ag Committee plays some role, but really most of this is done by the Finance Committee. Senator Mike Crapo from Idaho is going to take over as the Republican leader, probably the chairman, pending the outcome in Georgia, of the Finance Committee. And he's somebody who we've worked with for a very long time on dairy trade issues. He's been on the Finance Committee for a long time. I would go so far as to note that when he was a House member in the 1990s, then Congressman Crapo voted against the original NAFTA, in part because of the lack of dairy progress that it made. So he was somebody who we've worked with, and I know IDFA's worked with as well, quite a bit in this last 3-year period on the USMCA negotiations. He's been very much at the forefront of our efforts to secure proper implementation of the USMCA agreement. So no disrespect whatsoever to Senator Grassley. He's been an able steward of that committee for quite a while, but Senator Crapo is somebody that comes from one of the top 3 dairy states, and I think that will be quite a benefit to have him in that role. And Senator Ron Wyden from Oregon has also taken an interest in the dairy trade issues, and he will continue to be the top Democratic senator on the committee. So I just wanted to add that in, Corey, but that's a little bit of a flavor of who's going to be running the show here when it comes to some of the top ag issues in the new Congress. And I would just note that between, again, the new people coming in and the need for them to staff up, as well as the continued priority around COVID, it's going to be a little while before we get around to the nuts and bolts of talking about the next farm bill, but definitely happy to take some questions too.
And before we go to thank you, Paul. Before we go to our next poll question, I'm going to slip in 2 real follow-up questions here. One's for Dave. The one viewer chimes in here. You mentioned ag secretaries being confirmed by Inauguration Day, but any guesses how soon a nominee might be named by President-elect Joe Biden, Dave?
So it's interesting. I mean, all these things are, of course, considered in a package, if you will. So An ag secretary obviously is not going to necessarily, be considered without sort of looking at the other cabinet choices that the president-elect is making. So I think it all sort of depends on some of the other selections that the president-elect will make for other posts. I think it also depends, as Paul has talked about, the close makeup of the House of Representatives in the new Congress. Having Marcia Fudge step aside from her current congressional seat and be appointed to a cabinet position would normally be something that wouldn't really be a cause of alarm. But because the Democratic majority in the House is going to shrink quite a bit, and because the governor of Ohio would need to schedule a special election to fill that seat, and that would take some time, that would be a vacant Democratic seat for a period of months that would not have a vote, would not be able to help the new president pass legislation that might be something that he's going to try to get through. So factoring that in as well is another issue. Marcia Fudge is also, of course, a member of the Congressional Black Caucus. And the African American community was very much a part of the core constituency for the president-elect in the past election. So she has a lot of support and would be, I believe, the first Black woman to take on that role. So it will be interesting to see. But as I said, this will all be playing out in the context of other decisions that the president-elect will make regarding his cabinet and other senior positions in administration. So if he fills other roles with African-American folks, then he will it may take some of the pressure off here in terms of Marcia Fudge. So we'll see that there's a lot of pushing going on here. And this has emerged, I would say, as one of the more contentious cabinet appointments so far that we've seen in terms of the pushback from the sort of more traditional food and ag world behind Heidi Heitkamp and from the nutrition and food community behind Marcia Fudge. So it will be interesting to see how this plays out.
And Paul, the question for you here, we had a number of people chime in on that Georgia election here for the Senate. So right now, every state, we always want to put a little civics lesson here. All 50 states have 2 senators. It appears that we have 50 Republicans right now, 48 Democrats, and because of a lot of resignation in that, but we have Georgia has 2 people being elected here in that race. I think is January 5th. But talk real briefly in about 90 seconds on that, so people can get a little bit of better grasp of what's going on in Georgia.
Sure. So the reason why Georgia has these 2 elections is, number one, former Senator Isaacson resigned from the Senate about a year ago due to some health issues. He was not actually up for re-election until 2022, but his resignation prompted a sort of a short-term appointment of Kelly Loeffler. But when that happens, they have to have a special election to serve out the remainder of the term. That's why you have this second election in Georgia. Senator David Perdue was up for election anyway because his 6-year term that began in 2015 had ended. And then to the second point here, why are we having these runoffs? Well, Georgia is one of the states that requires you to get over 50% plus 1 on election day. And since neither Senator Perdue nor Senator Loeffler were able to reach that threshold, the top 2 people stay on the ballot. Everybody else gets knocked off, and they go to these January runoffs. So as long as Republicans win one of the 2, they will maintain control of the Senate with 51 seats. If Democrats were to win both, it would be 50-50, and then by virtue of Kamala Harris as vice president, they would be in the majority, and she would be the tiebreaker.
Very good. Let's go to that poll question here. Jim, go ahead and put that on the screen. What are you hoping for from the next Congress? Enforce dairy product standards of identity. We're talking about cow's milk versus all the others that masquerade there. B, improve farm workforce and immigrant labor. C, revise federal milk marketing orders. D, expand dairy product choices and nutrition programs. So this poll question is coming up a lot more split here, Andy, and you'll get the comment on that. We'll give all our viewers here a little bit of 10 more seconds to vote here. Just pick one here. Kind of want to see a snapshot here of time here. So go ahead, Jim, you can cut that off. We'll leave the poll up there while I introduce Andy here. And many of our Dairy Livestream viewers know Andy is a longtime economist at Cornell University, but he's been involved with dairy politics and policies for quite some time. In the 1990s, Andy had an appointment with the House Agriculture Committee, and he worked closely with Congress in its dairy policy initiatives. Andy also had several appointments with USDA's Office of the Chief Economist, where he chaired the USDA's Secretary's Dairy Industry Advisory Committee. Throughout the years, Andy also led teams for major dairy policy educational projects related to milk diversion program, the dairy termination program, federal order reform, and the dairy margin protection program. Andy, this is definitely going to be a unique 2 years for dairy. What's your take?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot to David and Paul for contributing their insights, which are certainly more intimate than what I would come up with. But there's a couple things I'd like to point out. First of all, we have to keep in mind Congress is the one that gets to create laws. They're the ones that get to pass a budget. They're the ones that get to say what program is going to end and what new might start and what amendments might be. I've often found it kind of amusing, really. You know, a candidate for the presidency will stand up and say, on day one, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, and then the next day I'm going to do these other 5 things. And by and large, mostly presidents can't do anything unless Congress gives them permission to. Now, certainly there are some laws that create some wiggle room that allow presidents to do things through executive orders. But in the main, you can only play with the rule book and the money that the Congress gives to you. So it's important to recognize Congress is the one that's going to decide what laws will be, whether or not we will have a new CARES Act, whether or not we'll have food boxes, whether or not we'll have money for income subsidies and all, the whole host of things. The executive branch executes those laws, and as I said, there's certainly some wiggle room. Presidents, as a single office, no one has more power than the president. But nevertheless, there is still a rule book that has to be followed. And also there's some important signaling that the president can do in terms of this trying to advocate priorities and creating some political incentives or political pressure to do certain things to have Congress create certain priorities. I think the fact that the House and the Senate are split is a challenge for those two bodies to figure out how to work together. We've seen plenty of examples of that, but also a challenge for the president to be able to come up with ideas that actually can see the light of day in both parts of the Congress. It's as Paul was pointing out with the numbers, numerically, somebody's going to be the majority, but there are no certain slam dunk, invulnerable majorities on either the United States Senate or the Congress. We've been in a system where there's a lot of pressure for all the Democrats to vote one way and all the Republicans to vote another way, but it's hardly ever that clean. And there are folks on the Republican side in the Senate that may not always agree with a certain position that the majority of their party would take, and likewise on the Democrat side. So I think it's going to be a real challenge, a real maybe interesting, a little scary lesson to find out if this very delicately balanced structure is going to end up paralyzing us or actually create an environment where we decide we have to get things done and we have to build the coalitions that allow us to do that. In that regard, I would say it is all the more important for the dairy industry and every other group that wants to advance an agenda to figure out how to work together. Paul and Dave have mentioned already a couple times that Paul's organization, which represents dairy cooperatives, which at their base are dairy farmer governed, and Dave's organization, which represents dairy processors, which include cooperatives, but also include proprietary and investor-owned businesses. Often these two organizations are in consonance. They agree that dairy standards of identity should be protected. They agree that trade should be promoted. But there are times when they have different positions around issues where buyers and sellers might see the world a little bit differently. And it's in those situations where it's incredibly important for those two organizations to sit down and work it out before you go to mom and dad in the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate and hope that mom agrees with you or dad agrees with you, and that's the way it works. And I think in this delicately balanced political environment, both the legislative and executive branch, it's going to be just all the more important if you're going to get something done for an industry to move together with some sort of unity of voice and try to deal with those issues and not require or expect that the United States Congress is somehow going to adjudicate that for us. We've always said that, you know, industry needs to get together, and if they are, we can do something. But I think if that was ever true before, I believe it's all the more true now. The other thing that is sort of related to this is those of us who've watched the agriculture committees and those of us who read about them are familiar with the idea that the agriculture committees in both the House and the Senate are famously bipartisan. You know, it's not always kumbaya, but the Democrats and Republicans, who are, regardless of which party happens to be in control in which chamber, have always said, we find ways to work together. And maybe that's because at the end of the day, they're representing a rural community that includes some diverse constituents, and it's in their natural interest. But I think what's also really key, and maybe more important, is these committees have what's called jurisdictions, have responsibilities, have like the first priority on program elements that are complementary. And there's no better example than production agriculture and food. The reason why we're talking about Martha Fudge as a potential candidate for Secretary of Agriculture is because most of the food assistance programs in the United States are run through USDA and have oversight responsibilities in the ag committees. It's a little different between the House and the Senate, but nevertheless, these come together. And because they come together, you can't get one thing moved ahead unless you're able to sort of horse trade and work together with somebody whose passion might be on the other side of the table. And so I think this environment also is incredibly valuable for production agriculture. It also means that I think if a Martha Fudge became Secretary of Agriculture, she might have a real passion for the food assistance side, but there's no way in the world that she could let go of the ag side. FSA would still be there. You'd still have dairy margin coverage. You'd still have crop insurance. You'd still have all of that stuff going on and a whole bunch of USDA employees that would be passionate about making sure that you had access to it. So as I see it, maybe, I hope we don't see conflict, but what I hope instead is that this precarious balance, this very narrow margins, actually gets people to say, we're not going to get anything done if we don't figure out how to work together.
Thank you, Andy. We have a number of questions that came in here, but we had one that came in here, and I'm going to answer it, and our colleagues here that may have more insight can go ahead. But a dairy farmer wrote in, why are we talking like we have a new president? The president is not elected by a popular vote. The Electoral College decides, and it can change, and points to the Gore versus Bush situation here. But I think we talked through a couple key dates here. We're in December now. Today is the 2nd, and by December 14th, the Electoral College will gather and vote. And based on what I've been reading in the Wall Street Journal and other venues here, and we even talked during dress rehearsal yesterday that a couple members of the Trump administration, in particular, Mr. Barr, even noted that the outcome has generally been decided. And so it is, the viewer is correct. It's not by popular vote. It is the Electoral College, but the way the results are coming in here, the Electoral College will cast its votes for Mr. Biden. Dave or Paul or Andy, anything you want to add on that one?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I guess I'll just mention one other thing about dates that are relevant here, even though it doesn't all happen at once. In the run-up to the Electoral College vote that Dave referenced, the individual states all do have to certify their own results following the different recounts that occur, and that's been playing out as we speak. And I think most, maybe not all, but most of the states where there was discussion about recounts and things like that have now gone and certified their numbers.
Andy kind of answered the first question we had come in here, but I want to follow up and ask it here because I think it isn't, Andy framed it very well, but one of the early questions we had come in is how would we prepare for an ag secretary who is focused on nutrition to understand the research, science, and policies that support dairy and production agriculture? I think Andy outlined how there could be some good synergies, but let's bring that a little to dairy. And Dave, if you want to start with that one.
Yeah, and that's an issue that I've worked on pretty extensively throughout my 6 years at IDFA. I mean, even when Tom Vilsack was secretary, one of the first things I got to do when I joined IDFA was bring some of our members over to USDA to sit down with him and to talk about why 1% flavored milk was going to be a more popular choice for kids in schools than skim milk. And if we really don't want to lose another generation of milk drinkers, we had to turn that around. Now, he wasn't able to do that when he was secretary. I think he had a sympathy for us and our position, but the White House was also involved in some of those nutrition decisions. So we were able to turn that around in early 2017 with the new administration, and that's something that I think is something that we'll have to work with this new incoming administration to make sure they understand that if they try to go back to the skim milk option in schools, we're going to have a lot of kids who are going to be not getting the nutritious benefits of milk, who are going to be wasting food, which none of us want to see happen because they'll be throwing milk away that they don't like the taste of. And again, we'll be well on our way to losing another generation of milk drinkers, which is not good for our industry. So there's a lot of education that's going to need to take place to make sure that the current administration's rules in this space stay where they are. And Paul and I are already working together on Capitol Hill to try to provide congressional support for USDA to make the right decision there. And that's one example. The other areas where we're going to see some activity, I think, will be in the SNAP area, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. I don't know that these food boxes are going to continue in the Biden administration. I doubt they will. What I would expect instead is that there will be more attention paid to increasing the amount of SNAP benefits available to families that participate in that program, both at the minimum level and at the maximum level. And that in turn can provide some opportunities for our industry in terms of consumption. And one of the things that we're working on as an association is to develop pilot programs in SNAP grocery stores that show what we might do to encourage people to buy more fluid milk in the SNAP program. And in particular, maybe coupons like the fruit and vegetable folks have used successfully for the past 10 years or so, where if you buy a gallon of milk at your grocery store, you get a coupon on your way out the door to get a free gallon of milk when you come back the next time. And we've got a pilot program in place that was authorized by the Farm Bill. We're getting funding for that. We hope the new administration is going to pay particular attention to getting that program really established so that we can go national with that in the next Farm Bill, because we think that will help a lot on the fluid milk side as well.
Anything to add on that, Paul or Andy?
Well, the only thing I would add is that I don't know, you guys probably remember how long Marsha Fudge has been on the Ag Committee, but she may have a personal interest in nutrition. She's been the chair of the subcommittee that deals with nutrition, but she's been immersed in at least the political world of agriculture for as long as she's been on the Ag Committee. And Ohio is a substantial agricultural state, so maybe not Cleveland so much, but that's part of her home world. So her passion may be nutrition, but she has been immersed in agriculture, understands the politics, has some familiarity with the program, so it's not a clean slate for her.
Yeah, I was just going to add to the points that Dave and Andy made. I would say that Marsha Fudge has been quite receptive to working with the whole ag community. We've certainly worked with her. Ohio dairy folks have gotten to know her, and she listens and she approaches things fairly, and is somebody we've been able to get support from on quite a few things.
So what we're going to let I'm going to let the panelists know we had a boatload of questions coming in the last 5 minutes. So we're going to speed this up. I'm going to probably call on one person to answer each question because there's a number of thoughtful questions. Andy, we're going to put a slide on the screen here. We're going to have you tackle this one. I know Dave pointed out under the new administration, these food box programs probably will not continue, but the slide and the question came in from California. What could the USDA do to purchase a bulk butter during the ongoing pandemic? And the reason he sent this slide in, you'll see what that red line is, what butter inventories are doing here, and then the averages from the previous year. So we had a lot of uptake on cheese in the past 7-8 months, but it didn't really help those in states that had a lot of butter manufacturing, in particular California. Thoughts on that, Andy?
Well, I think the first question is what's going to happen to the economy, and do we think we even need to have food boxes or that kind of food assistance at anywhere near the scale? I mean, it's not that long ago. The question was, are we going to have enough butter? And so it's changed dramatically. I don't think there's going to be any magic with vaccines or the world going back to normal, but I think we are moving to the downside of the curve in terms of the disease, and that we're going to see positive economic effects. I think that's going to mean people being able to go back to restaurants later in 2021. I also think that means more people going back to work and not requiring food assistance. So I think the need will decline. Also, I think if we say, well, maybe there's not going to be so much food boxes, but I can't imagine Democrats not wanting to have a vigorous SNAP program, not being supportive of putting money into the Emergency Food Assistance Program, TFAP, and kind of going back to a very, very substantial infrastructure of food assistance that predates all of these ad hoc programs. So number one, I think the need will decline, and number two, I think there'll be plenty of food assistance. It's just a different format.
Thank you, Andy. The next question, Paul, we've had 3 people come on this one here and one came in early. Now, obviously, we'll have a new Congress next year, so all bills have to be reintroduced, but a number of farmers want to know this. What do you make of Senate bill called the Farm Systems Reform Act, FSRA, that was introduced by U.S. Senator Cory Booker, he's from New Jersey, which aims to eliminate all CAFOs in the U.S. within 20 years. Senator Elizabeth Warren, Massachusetts, co-sponsored the bill in June, and U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders, Vermont, co-sponsored it in July. Paul, what is your take on that one?
I've seen that bill, and I think it's a bill that, Senator Booker and the other folks you mentioned are going to kind of continue to advocate for. But if you look at the roster of supporters from that bill, you won't find probably many, if any, of the Democratic senators that serve on the Agriculture Committee or Democratic senators in general that are looked to as leaders on issues in this space. And I don't think you'll find maybe one Republican senator, but beyond that, I doubt. So I don't see it as a bill that has any real traction. That doesn't mean it won't continue to get introduced again in future Congresses. And this is something that I notice often in Congress. Bills will get introduced and there will be a big splash around them being rolled out because the supporters have the microphone and they're kind of talking about the stakeholders that like the bills will be doing the same thing. And then once that's done, they kind of disappear from the public view because nothing's really going to happen with them. This bill is really one of those, in my view. It may get introduced, but it's not going to really go anywhere. And part of the reason for that in the Senate, you may have a handful of people that feel strongly about it, but every state has a certain amount of agriculture for the most part. And you look at Senate Farm Bill votes in recent years, and 80 something, almost 90 senators voted for the last Farm Bill. They're not going to want to upset that balance for the most part, and they do look at it as a way to work across the aisle. And with ag being such a parochially sensitive issue, I don't see a bill like that getting a lot of traction.
Dave, the next question is coming to you, and it relates to the poll question, the third one we had. The viewer asks, are we late to the game in stopping or reducing the names of other products that want to claim milk titles, such as coconut, almond, or soy, or is it a battle we can win?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, FDA is still engaged in that process of defining, how the term milk and other dairy terms can be applied to plant-based products. And then now, of course, we've got an additional, interesting development on our radar screen, which is cellular-based products and how those are going to be labeled going forward. And that's a little different because those products are the same as what we produce out of a cow. They just come out of a test tube. They're the same caseins, they're the same proteins, and so it's not the same dynamic as when we're talking about plant-based versus dairy-based. So that's something that we're all going to have to wrestle with as an industry going forward. And I would say, in that regard, sustainability is something that we're going to have to focus on. Again, this new administration, and we are focusing on. I don't mean to make it sound like we aren't. The new administration is going to be looking at sustainability in a very from a global perspective, and I think they see farmers as being part of the answer to the problem, not part of the problem itself. And that's encouraging for us who work with rural America. I think everything I've seen out of the Biden team is that they see farmers playing a positive role on climate change and sustainability going forward. But for us to be able to continue to reach consumers that put a premium on sustainability in their product choices, we're going to have to continue to do work in that space. And that's going to affect how we relate to the cellular ag options that are coming online, obviously not only in the dairy space, but also across the food and ag spectrum.
Andy, when I was in Washington, D.C. and spoke at the USDA Ag Economic Outlook Forum for the dairy portion, there was a lot of talk in the hallways about the Economic Research Service, USDA's ERS. It's moved from Washington, D.C. to Kansas City. Is there any chance that might be reversed, is a question that came in, or is that a done deal?
Well, I guess there's always a chance. I don't know whether or not USDA has contracted permanent offices for ERS. I know when they first started relocating people, they didn't have it. But I guess my point is there's going to be a cost to that relocation. And there's a lot of that toothpaste is not going back into the tube. There are people that have made other arrangements and are moving on and gone to different agencies or retired. So going back to what it was, I don't think is on the table. Moving it back to Washington, I suppose is. But I don't know. My gut reaction is at best that's 50-50.
This question, Paul, we're going to send to you. Thoughts on the Congress getting involved in federal milk marketing order amendments? What specific, let's keep it big picture here, because the question then goes on what specific provisions would be in play for Congress to get involved with. But go ahead and take 90 seconds for that one.
I think it's hard for Congress to get involved in federal orders, first of all, because they're so arcane that virtually no congressional staff, maybe one or two, have any knowledge of them, number one. And number two, there's such regionally broken out issues that you'd almost immediately have all kinds of regional battles that you wouldn't be able to put back in the box. In the last Farm Bill, obviously, we had the Class 1 change that was made, and that was a product of discussion between us and IDFA, obviously, and that was included in the House bill and the Senate bill, I think, in near identical form. And I think the committees liked that there was that kind of consensus behind that provision, and so it was easier to advance it. But the sausage making of getting that consensus on federal orders, I think Andy touched on this a little earlier in his comments, is probably hard to do in Congress because you don't really have the expertise. Mr. Thompson, who's going to take over, hopefully will take over the Republican spot on the Ag Committee. He came to Congress in 2009, so his first year was that kind of major downturn in the industry. So he'll have some recollection of the discussions that went on then. But even with that, it's just really, really hard because the staff expertise isn't there, and it's very hard to manage. And if you try to do that in a farm bill, you'd come up with 500 new reasons right away to tank the farm bill because nobody would be in agreement that you need this amendment to make the Northeast happy and then this for the Southeast, and it would become a horrible mess. So that's my read right now. We'll see in a year or two if I'm right or not.
Dave, this question comes in from a Michigan dairyman. Polling indicated that 80+% of farmers didn't vote for President-elect Joe Biden. What impact could that have on ag issues?
Well, I take the new president at his word, which is he wants to be a president for all Americans, including those who did not vote for him. He has, I think, strong ties to rural America. He comes from a fairly rural state himself, Delaware. So I think he understands a lot of the issues that are important to us. And if you read the position papers on his campaign website, you know that he favors a lot of issues that are important to us, including expanding rural broadband. in a major way, and it's something that we've talked about for many years but haven't done enough about. And I think that's something that that the new administration will take on. Talked about sustainability. We talked about trade. Trade's going to be a little different. Trade was the most important issue that was identified by our viewers today. This administration, the new administration, is going to have a different view on that. They were more aligned on multilateral trade possibilities than the Trump administration was. The Trump administration wanted to focus on bilateral trade agreements, and whether we can join some of those multilateral trade agreements that were negotiated during the Obama years now at this late date is going to be remain to be seen. I do think trade will be something that the new administration is going to have to address early, though, because the Trade Promotion Authority to get trade agreements through Congress expires on June 30th of next year. So if we're going to get that reauthorized, that's whether the new administration wants to talk about it or not, they're going to have to work and engage with Congress to try to get that done to preserve their ability to do trade deals down the road. So there's a lot of positive things that we can, I think, work on together with the new administration.
Andy, the next question, and Dave, you bring up a good point on rural broadband. We have a young man, 13-year-old, that works on our farm, and he's saying, well, I'm getting 3 Fs in school. I'm like, what's going on? He goes, well, I can't connect to the internet. And I said, well, you got to talk to your mom and dad. And he got an iPad from the school here. But, in these rural communities, if these young people don't speak up, they're getting left behind here. And it's a little bit like rural electrification generations ago here. We're getting a number of questions, Andy, on negative producer price differentials. But what we're going to frame it here is, if we're going to work on them, where will that likely happen? And probably federal order reform, Congress wouldn't get involved in that. But what's your take?
Well, again, keep in mind, negative PPDs only occur under some very specific situations, primarily where the cheese market is skyrocketing, going up by a large amount very quickly. Creating a gap between blocks and barrels is part of it, but the big thing is a gap between class 4 and class 3. And again, very quickly rises. I think changing the possibility or changing a situation where you can theoretically have a negative PPD, I don't see that being fixed anytime soon. However, what I do think is that the economic situation where we see these market effects is going to go away. If we don't have people out there trying to stuff a cardboard box full of fresh cheddar cheese right now, and people who don't know what the heck they're doing because they never bought that kind of cheddar cheese before, I think we're going to take a lot of that pressure off that drove us to this outcome. So I think we'll see less of it, not because we fixed the system, but because the economics that gave us those market results are modified. Changing the system is tough work. I think Paul mentioned that's just, if there was an easy answer, trust me, we would have figured it out a long time ago. The reality is the answer is not easy. For every good thing you can come up with, there's some bad thing that you got to figure out how to get around.
We're going to go around the horn here. You're going to say one that's safe and one that's on shaky ground. We're going to start with Paul here. What government programs that exist now relating to dairy seem safe? What are those that may be on shaky ground? So we're getting close to the top of the hour. We're going to do safe first. Paul, what might be safe?
Safe in terms of its viability to stay around, I'd say the Dairy Margin Coverage Program was enacted in the last Farm Bill. At least is authorized for several more years and probably isn't going anywhere. Do you want me to go to unsafe, or are you going to go around everybody first?
Dave's safe.
I think the SNAP program, which obviously affects our industry in a big way, is safe and will expand.
Andy.
Yeah, I agree. Legacy programs, SNAP, federal orders, crop insurance, I don't see them going away.
All right. Paul, shaky.
I'd say the coronavirus food assistance setup that was put out this year. Sure, there'll be some additional COVID relief in the new year, but it may look very different, especially the food box program. I wouldn't expect to see that one back.
Dave, anything to add there?
No, only what I've said before, which is we're going to keep a close eye on the 1% flavored milk in schools, because that to me could be a little shaky depending on, again, the team that's put in place at USDA.
Andy?
This hits a little bit the last question, but I'm going to say there are no perfectly paved roads on any of this stuff. But if I would be optimistic about labor, I would be optimistic about trade. I would tend to be more pessimistic about environment and nutrition.
Well said. There's a dairy farmer that asked, would it be possible to offer kids better options, 2% or whole milk? Let's coming back to Dave. That's been something, Matt, there you asked that question, that they've been working on for our collective dairy industry for some time. We want to get there. Will we get there anytime soon? I'm not going to bet many poker chips on it, but we'll see what Dave and Paul say there.
Yeah, I think that the answer to that is all bound up in the dietary guidelines process, which occurs every 5 years. We're coming to the end of that. It's a frustration, I know, for us, and I'm sure it is for National Milk as well, in terms of we've got some great research that shows that dairy fats are beneficial for consumers to consume, and certainly don't hurt. And yet we're not able to move the needle from this panel of scientists to say anything beyond 1% is available or allowed. So 2% in whole milk remain things that Paul and I work on to try to get those into the nutrition programs. But a lot of the nutrition programs, not all, SNAP is an example, it's not of one you can buy any kind of milk you want. But the child nutrition programs in WIC all are based on what the current dietary guidelines allow. And right now that line is drawn at 1% or below. And we've got and unfortunately, we don't have another crack at that for 5 more years. So that's the challenge we're facing.
We're at the top of the hour. I can clearly say as MC, we're not going to clear the deck of questions, but let's wrap up with one here. And this is just your guys' intuition on this. If we are at a split Senate, how might Vice President-elect Harris vote on dairy if she happens to be the tiebreaker? Anybody want to tackle that one?
I'll give it a try. In her brief time in the Senate, she hadn't really had a lot of contentious ag votes. I suppose that in the context of a farm bill or an ag spending bill, there could periodically be a contentious vote. We had one in the Senate 3 years ago on standards of identity. We had one in the House on raw milk. So these things do come up. No real template for how she would vote. I guess I would just say the votes of that nature are very, very rare.
Yeah, I agree with Paul. I think the other point that we would make to her if we had the opportunity is how big a dairy state California is, and a reminder of that. So,
well, I want to thank our guests, Dave Carlin, Paul Bleiberg, and Andy Novakovic for being on the program this week. Very insightful. We went through a lot of questions here. Next week, Wednesday, we're going to have a conversation on the 2021 Dairy Market Outlook. I want to remind all our dairy farm viewers here that the sign up for the 2021 coverage for the Dairy Margin Coverage Program concludes on December 11th. So you got till next Friday to do that. I think we learned a lot in this pandemic year that if you didn't sign up for that first 5 million pounds of milk, you better really, really consider doing that. So again, we're going to look at the 2021 Dairy Market Outlook next Wednesday. It'll be sponsored by Diamond V. On behalf of my team here, Caitlin Allen, our producer, Jim Baltz, and our guests, Dave, Paul, and Andy, thank you for joining us on Dairy Livestream. Have a great day.